So we've talked about theory, we've talked about training and implementation, and I wish I had another hour and we would talk about the ancillary side effect of running an RLA, which is ballot organization and storage and control, that solves a lot of the problems that were mentioned earlier. But we're going to move and talk about technology just a little bit. So as you all are aware, part of the issue that has precluded some states from implementing a risk-limiting audit process is the lack of paper ballots or a voting system that could produce a cast vote record. In addition to that, as we're finding as we're doing some of these pilots, even for voting systems that do have a paper ballot, do have a CVR, there are some different considerations, some things to think about in terms of the logistics and the size of the ballot and the fields that are on that cast vote record and how we can tie those in with our ballot manifest, essentially our map of where those ballots are stored and the quantities. And so there are a lot of technical considerations with the voting system. In addition to that, we've mentioned, you've heard mentioned a little bit, the use of audit software and audit tool, and really it serves a couple of purposes. In addition to calculating, I was saying an appropriate sample size. Now I've learned this morning to say a starting sample size. It can help in the random selection by using a pseudo-random number generator. It can help us keep track of discrepancies and know, most importantly, when the audit needs to stop. And the other thing that those of you that have ever been involved in a hand count or any sort of hand tally know, I think someone said it earlier, as human beings, we're terrible at tedious, repetitive tasks. And so this audit software also serves as a type of interface to allow the audit teams to input voter markings. So there are a number of things that technology can actually do to assist with this. And so for the next hour, you're going to hear a little bit about where we are with voting technology and voting systems. You're going to hear about some pilot audits. You're going to hear about audit software. And then maybe most importantly, you're going to hear about what it takes or what thoughts might need to be considered from a state who's going from no paper to thinking about jumping right into risk-limiting audits. So we're going to start with Jerome here on my right, your left. And Jerome and I know each other from Colorado days. He's now working as the election technology and liaison auditor with the EAC, and he's done a fabulous job taking his knowledge of voting systems and risk-limiting audits and producing a white paper that was published by the EAC, a practical application to risk-limiting audits. He's been very helpful in doing pilot audits with Marion County, which you'll hear about in just a little bit, as well as the audits that were just the pilot audits that were done in Michigan this week. Jerome worked for 10 years for the Colorado Secretary of State, is that right? But I got to know him when I came to Colorado as the RLA guy. When we first did a little trial pilot in Arapahoe in 2016, Jerome was kind enough to come into my office and bring his team and sit down and really help me and my staff understand what tools were available, what wasn't available, what we still needed to work out, and where we needed to go. And so he's done a tremendous job quietly pushing that forward and really guided the working group that Colorado put together. Jerome was the one guiding that, organizing that, putting the agendas together, and so he deserves a lot of credit for his role in Colorado. Next, we'll hear from Jay Bagga. Dr. Bagga is a professor of computer science at Ball State University. He's also the co-director of the Indiana Voting System Technical Oversight Program, so they provide testing and certification in Indiana. And he helped pioneer the first in the nation legislation authorizing certification and testing of the e-poll books there. He's going to talk a little bit about the pilot audit that they did earlier this year. And then next we'll hear from Mark Lindeman, and all of you know him. He is working now for Verified Voting as their Senior Science Technology Policy Officer. But we know Mark as, co-author of A Gentle Introduction to Risk-Limiting Audits, and I joke that I call Mark and Philip the godfathers of RLA. Mark, I think very highly of, because he's one of those people who has patiently, over this last year, provided me with a lot of information, a lot of gentle correction, a lot of guidance, and some very good suggestions for how to make this work for everybody. So I'm excited to hear Mark's thoughts. And then last we'll hear from Bob Giles. Bob is the director of the New Jersey Division of Elections. And I have to say something. You know, New Jersey takes a lot of crap for not having paper ballots and for having this antiquated voting system. But no, Bob actually has done a lot. I think sometimes we forget that election officials are bound by the resources that their state are willing to provide and by the rules and regulations set by their state. Bob is currently the president of NASA, the National Association of State Election Directors. He's on the standards board for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. He's really pushed forward cybersecurity and security best practices and is on the executive committee for the EIGCC. And I will just say, I think if we can tackle this, the next thing, security audits, might be a breeze because Bob's done a fantastic job with his team in the state of New Jersey and really thinking about how to do security audits. So I'm excited to hear from him at the end of this panel about thoughts about moving New Jersey in the direction of a new voting system and paper ballots and RLAs. So with that, we'll let Jerome get started.
Thank you. So a farmer, a lawyer, and an engineer walked into a bar. And I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere. I'm not good at telling jokes, but come to find out they're talking about elections. And in the space we work in, that really is what happens, is we have this cross-section of every community that participates, that is plays some role in elections. In election administration, I'm grateful to be a part of this industry, I guess, or entity, whatever you want to call it.
And I forgot to say you are an engineer.
I am an engineer.
The joke was about him.
Yeah, it's a self-joke. So today I'm going to just talk briefly about the role technology plays in conducting risk-limiting audits. And this is a condensed representation of voting systems in the United States. Over the years, some of that stuff you may be familiar with, and others not so much. Like, oh, what's that? It actually counts paper. And so I just wanted to provide this visual about kind of all the different things that election officials have to manage, as well as all of the policies and processes and rules associated with those things. And so just at a high level, I don't plan on going into a whole lot of detail in this presentation, but I would like, if hopefully we have enough time to take questions, because I want to be able to speak specifically to questions about voting technology and not just my perspective or opinion about it. But one thing I have identified about it, and just as a background, I was an engineer at one point, and at some point in 2007, about the time Hillary Hall and Pam Anderson were clerks, and Hillary Rudy started, I think, a little before me at the state. We were in a recertification effort, and I applied for this job on Craigslist to test voting systems, and it was supposed to be a 2-week gig, and I needed a job, and I'm like, I know how to test stuff, and then here we are. So I've been working with voting systems for a long time. I've touched thousands of pieces of equipment personally. In Colorado, that's one thing the state's responsible for, is installing the software on all the voting systems. We don't allow the vendors to do that. And so I have had my hands very dirty in this business, and so I bring that level of experience. And so one of the limitations we have with instituting pretty much anything related to voting systems, but specifically post-election audits, is the certification requirements. that we have the federal standards, the VVSG, but on top of that, a lot of states have their own specific requirements. And as a result, that first visual we had of the different voting systems, some of those systems were from the same manufacturer, but different revisions. And even if you dug deeper into the software side, you would see that for one vendor, you could have multiple versions because they'll build it for Wisconsin or Colorado, or different versions for specific states based on their needs and their requirements. And so this is, I think, a limitation in that it's like, okay, risk limiting audits, but and comparison risk limiting audits being the gold standard, but our requirements don't require that. And so you're limited, like, well, we don't require that, and what does it take to then change that requirement? And in some places, it's easier to change than other places, and so that's a limitation. Then there's the obvious one, the low-hanging fruit, of course, the lack of a paper record, and then one that really bothers me probably more than any is this last one, confusing exports. And we just went through this exercise in Michigan, where it was this very thing where I'm spending, the night at the hotel, like, seriously, like, I got to deal with this stuff, and so it's a challenge, and it's a limitation, and I can have opinions about how we can solve this, but and I do, but I don't want to take the time to express that, because then, knowing me, I'll start calling out specific vendors, and then I'll get a call from my manager and say, yeah, don't do that anymore. So I'll just stop there. Probably if I drank, it'd take one drink to get me drunk, and so then I'd just probably say anything. The current design, we have this current design, there's a lot of improvement that's been made over the last several years, particularly, and that's in providing human-readable cast vote records. Some systems do a really great job at doing this, and that's the reason why human-readable. How many of you have ever read an XML file or a JSON file, and you can interpret what all that means just by looking at it one time? Probably some of you who are really into that type of thing, but most of us like to see, like, some kind of tabular format, like 1 equals 1, and so that's been an improvement, and that's something that I, being in voting system certification at the federal level, I'm starting to see more of. From vendors as they're starting to hear from the community, their customers, and saying, we want this, and I think they're doing a pretty good job of meeting the needs of the customers, or at least listening to them and recognizing the trends in our industry to say, oh, this is something that's not going away. For instance, risk limiting audits, it's not going away. It's gaining a lot of momentum. And to reiterate what the Colorado group said earlier is pilot, pilot, pilot. Those of you who know me fairly well know that I stress that a lot and all the time, because, and I guess that just comes from my training, is that you just have to keep testing. And it's the long game. We're not trying to solve this in a year, and I think it'd be kind of crazy to try to solve it in 2 years, just because there is so much involved and really reaching out to the local community and moving this giant thing forward. And when I heard a quote recently from the series The Patriot on Amazon Prime, it said the guy, the main character said, it's you go halfway plus one step, and he's like, that's what it takes. And he was going on this mission where he was going through electric fences, and he's like, it's halfway plus one step, because if you get there, you're not going to turn back. And that's kind of how I see stuff like risk limiting audits, where it's like you go halfway plus one step. It's like, you know what, that wasn't so bad. We could keep going. And that's just kind of how I see this as a public policy, is it just takes time. And it's on us, especially in the room, the advocates, to really stress that it is a learning experience and something that will require patience in implementing. That's a side note to everything else that's on this slide. Another improvement is ballot imprinting, but this also has its challenges because in some states this will be totally negative. Like, you're gonna actually print a number on my ballot? It's obviously been really successful in Colorado. It was really helpful in one of the pilots we had in Michigan. But this is something that is getting a lot of movement too, where voting systems are providing this utility to be able to imprint like non-sequential numbers to ballots to help with the ballot comparison risk-limiting audit. And one of the design challenges that I see is just the independent verification. And what I mean by that is there are vendors who say, oh, well, it's self-audits, and there's this self-verification. And I don't think that's good enough, but we do need independent verification. And that's one thing that RLAs do, but that's something that's in the design. Some of the design practices is this. They're starting to recognize there does need to be the independent verification element. And so just a little brief history of kind of where we were voting to where we are. Common data format seems to be taking forever, but it needs to, just because there's so many voices in this group. But maybe that's the future. Maybe the B word is the future. Maybe it's end-to-end verification. I don't know. It's all stuff that's I think we're thinking about as we move forward when it comes to technology. We're never going to please entire groups of people, but this is stuff that is right at our doorstep. It's not just thought material anymore. It's stuff that is seriously being looked at and developed. And so I don't know if it really is the future or if it's just an exercise, but we're making improvements, and maybe it is. And lastly, the flight just didn't happen. The future is bright. Before I started college, I still really like history, and for a brief moment I thought about studying history instead of electrical engineering. And then I'm like, but history teachers don't make any money. And so that was the deciding factor for me. And being in Washington, D.C., I like going to the museums and can spend hours there. And I was recently in the Air and Space Museum. And then the Wright brothers exhibit really just caught my attention to see that we went from a wheel to a bike with wings, to then just launching people out into space, and then now we have these jets that take us everywhere, and places that are taking us to Mars, and so the future is bright. We're getting better at a lot of things in elections, and myself, I don't like to be pessimistic about any of it, because we are improving, and our elections are better than they have been, and they are getting better, and so they're going to continue to get better. That's my presentation. Here's my contact information. I do want to mention about our agency. We are always open to best practices. If you have any kind of documentation in regards to best practices, please send them our way. We like to post what the election community is talking about and what has worked for them, and we like to put that on our website. So the EAC plug there. But feel free to contact me about anything voting system related or risk-limiting audit related. I'll be glad to talk to you for a couple of minutes. But not next week. I'm out of the office next week. But thank you all.
Well, thank you. with all these presentations and panels that we've had since morning, I think my work has become easier because I don't have to do any background on RLAs. So I was thinking of giving you a report on what we did in our pilot RLA in Indiana. But I'm not going to talk about the RLAs themselves, but the process around it, the preparation for the RLA, and where we were and where we are now. Of course, the RLA did happen over 2 days. And recently, there's been an RLA pilot also in 3 cities in Michigan, earlier this week. And Jerome was involved in that heavily. And Jerome was also involved in our RLA pilot in Marion County, Indiana, which is the city of Indianapolis included in that. So I want to talk about Indiana a little bit and what we did and where we are. And Jerome talked about halfway and 1 step. Well, we've taken the first step. So the next step for us will be the halfway, and hopefully we can go further. So I'm part of VSTOP, the Voting System Technical Oversight Program, which has been around since about 2007, based at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, the home of Dave Letterman, if some of you, funded by the Indiana Secretary of State through General Assembly. And some of our activities are to develop and propose procedures and protocols for certification and testing of both voting systems and electronic poll books, and training and security of voting systems. So if you put the voting systems and electronic poll books together, we like to call them election systems. That seems to be the term we like to use together. So we recommend voting systems and electronic poll books for certification to the state. So Indiana has 92 counties, and there are 5 voting system vendors and 5 electronic poll book vendors, but total 9 vendors because we have 1 overlap. There is 1 vendor who does both electronic poll books and voting systems. Now, out of the 92 counties, roughly a half of the counties use DREs. So we are a predominant DRE state in that sense, about 50%. And the other half do use OPSCANs and or some combinations of DREs. So a few years ago, when we said RLA, not at all possible with the state like ours. So before 2016, there was no mention of VVPAT or voter auditable paper and such. But since 2016, a lot has changed. And in this morning's introduction, we saw how things have changed since 2016 and where we were and where we are going. Also, we were one of the first states to certify electronic poll books starting in 2013. And if you go to the NCSL site, you'll find a lot about different states using electronic poll books. And Indiana gets a prominent place there, which we are happy to see. And also, there are some audit requirements in Indiana, but Indiana is not among those 30 states that were mentioned about this morning, and again on the NCSL site, you could find some more details. But recently, there have been some audit requirements. So one of those in Indiana Code 312.3.58 says that you want to monitor the number of votes cast on a DRE and also the number of voters who checked in on an electronic poll book, let's say. And you want to match those numbers. And if those numbers are not within a threshold, then that triggers some sort of an audit. So there's something that has come up in the 2018 legislation in Indiana, but nothing beyond that. And again, as I said before, in recent years, there have been a lot of interesting discussion and questions on the integrity of elections and the security of election systems. And Indiana has seen its own share of discussion. And that's kept us busy at VSTOP. So we have an internal joke. We are called VSTOP, but with the things that we do, we should really be called We Never Stop. So the physical and cybersecurity of election equipment, recently Indiana also passed another bill, SB 327, which talks about physical and cybersecurity, signed in March 2018. So there are two aspects of it, and VSTOP has been helping develop the cybersecurity best practices aspects. But there's also the physical security where counties have to worry about the storage of equipment, a chain of custody, and such. So now it's been spelled out in great detail on how that should be handled. Another thing that happened recently, another development was this creation of the Indiana Executive Council on Cybersecurity, or the Council. So in January 2017, the governor of Indiana established this council to form an understanding of Indiana's cyber risk profile, to identify priorities and to establish some strategic framework. And elections became a natural part of this council in terms of being one of the major committees. So this council has several pillars, as they call it. And one of the pillars is the elections. And the elections committee is chaired by our Secretary of State. And VSTOP sits on that elections committee as a member. And so as a part of that, our contribution, VSTOP's contribution to that council was recommendation of bringing in risk limiting audit pilots. And that was quite well received in the last year or couple of years, whereas earlier there was no talk of such an activity in Indiana. So suddenly the profiles have changed, the awareness has changed, and that's, I think, a positive aspect. Of course, Jerome talked about challenges in terms of technology, and we also face those challenges in terms of technology. But we have taken that first step. So I mentioned already the elections committee and the council. The members of that election committee have a wide representation. There are members from county clerks, election officials, the statewide voter registration system, SVRS, which is our one voter registration database. There is one vendor that handles. We are a top-down state in that sense. We have one voter registration database for the entire state. Indiana Election Division and VSTOP, and some others. And VSTOP was also tasked with creating some best practices, as I mentioned, and a security appraisal of our election equipment. And that's where a pilot RLA became a natural process or a natural thing to include. And that's what we wanted to do. Ball State University's Bowen Center for Public Affairs also conducts a survey called the Hoosier Survey. And so in September 2017, they did a sample of 600 Indiana residents. And this is one among several surveys that happens about the confidence level. So the question is, what level of confidence do you have that your vote in the last election was properly recorded and accurately counted? And as you see from those numbers of the survey of those 600 residents, roughly 40% didn't have a very high level of confidence. And that number tells us that there are those lingering questions about the perception of the accuracy of elections too. And there are many other surveys that support that. So based on all this, we thought that doing an RLA pilot in Indiana was a natural thing for us to do. So in May, over 2 days, the VSTOP team conducted Indiana's first RLA pilot in Marion County. As I said, Marion County is a large county, includes the city of Indianapolis, 600,000 registered voters. So we couldn't have done it by ourselves because we looked around. Of course, we looked at Colorado as an example, and we found all the literature. So naturally, and we've been in the state certification conferences over the last several years, and I've known Jerome over all this time while he was in Colorado. And then great thing happened, he moved to EAC. For a while, I lost you, and then I found out. And that was great news, too, because from EAC, then he was going to be able to help out, set up this RLA. And also, Jerome put us in touch with Ron and Mayuri. And so it took us roughly 3 months or 4 months to get to the preparation. So I want to talk a little bit about the experience of setting it up. So it's not a trivial task, as we saw from the presentations from Colorado and all. It requires a lot of preparation, a lot of acceptance. Initially, Marion County was very reluctant when we approached them. And Marion County happens to be one paper ballot county, so we chose that. Initially, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of questions as to what this involves. But then eventually and with help from Jerome and others, they came around to the acceptance that this is something good for the county and good for the state. And others who have been doing pilots have had the same experience as we hear. And the big thing for us is, since VSTOP program is funded by the secretary and supported, she's been she's the benefactor. She's really a large supporter of this. So when she was on board with this RLA, things moved from there quite well. And she's quite happy that we are going in that direction. So I won't talk about the actual specifics of the risk limiting audit per se, because you heard a lot about, and you actually done a simulation here of the risk limiting audits. So briefly, with the help of Jerome and Ron and Mayuri, we chose 3 precincts, 3 races and several precincts to do our pilot. We chose the 2016 presidential election, 5 precincts within Marion County. We chose the 2018 primary Democratic sheriff in Marion County with 10 precincts, and we chose the 2018 Republican U.S. senator. And there were sufficient margins there, and with discussions within the RLA team and VSTOP, we decided that that's what we wanted to do. So once we had gone through this point, then it was a matter of meeting. It was meeting after meeting after meeting, just like say pilots and pilots. We had several meetings. There was a meeting most every week or sometimes twice a week with Marion County, with Mayuri, with Ron, and with Jerome, mostly over phone. And Liz can now kind of point to that because she's done similar things for Michigan. And so in May we did that, and it required 2 days for us. So we were there half day the first day and a full day the second, roughly, to do this. We set up the ballots in such a way, the manifest and how the ballots were going to be sampled. 2 of the audits were ballot polling audits, the first 2. The presidential and the sheriff. And the last one was comparison polling. And we did that without, and that was really a simulated one. That was a small one. We didn't have cast vote records, and we still tried to do a comparison. So one of us acted as a voting system and acted as if that person was the cast vote reader. So that was a small sample we handled, but it was a great learning experience. So as I mentioned already, over a month of preparation and meetings with the RLA team and the Marion County staff, overcoming some of the initial reluctance about the RLAs, especially from the county, from their elections officials, and from the state. There was a lot of concerns about these outcomes. One of the concerns that we found was, what happens if the RLA overturns one of these results? What happens? Of course, our universe was limited. We were only doing RLAs in a small number of precincts, not over the entire county. But still, that concern was there. What if something comes out of it? These are certified elections. What happens if it overturns? So there were those concerns. But eventually, there was overall acceptance of the RLAs by the secretary and other. Once they came around, the county officials, they were very strong cooperation. They really got everything done the way we wanted, the way Jerome suggested. So it ended quite well. And so much so that now we are ready to do our second pilot sometime soon next year. And then we'll go from there. So some of the other next steps that I want to talk about, again, the secretary is very enthusiastic about conducting more pilots. As I mentioned earlier, about half the counties use DREs, no paper. But this vendor, we have a vendor which is in about half of these DRE counties, is now working on a modification to add the VVPAT feature to the DREs that they use. And of course, I've been just reading through the Orange County, California report too that was mentioned earlier about the VVPAT. But at least it's a step in the right direction. At least we are going to go through that. And there is a demo that VStop has scheduled with this vendor later in December. So they are going to show to us. And they may have demoed this in other places. So, and the secretary, again, is quite supportive of this. So that'll bring some sort of paper trail in all the counties if this goes ahead, which we, again, think is a step in the right direction. We have also followed the progress of other RLA pilots, which have been conducted and are being conducted, and even this week in Michigan in three different jurisdictions. And of course, we continue to depend on Jerome and others to help us out with this. But again, couldn't have done it without the support of all these individuals that I already mentioned. And we'll look upon them again as we do some more. So count on us to see some more pilots coming out of Indiana in the next year. Thank you.
Actually, I'd like to be able to see the time. There we go. I decided to dare to be short. We'll see if I pull it off. But to that end, I figured I would be coming after a lot of people who would have been talking about software support for risk-limiting audits, and so it came to pass. So rather than get sucked into clicking through a PowerPoint, my face is not the most interesting thing, but it's the only thing that will move during this presentation. Better or worse, there it is. First, a promotional announcement. I was asked again to encourage you all to read and comment on the principles and best practices for post-election tabulation audits. So if you weren't able to nab a physical copy, I'm sure you can, yep, there you go. It looks just like that. So yeah, it looks like maybe there are about 5 left. So, get them. Okay, but they're also online, as are the Orange County and Fairfax reports on pilot audits. I'll talk a little bit about Fairfax. So most of the time when I talk with people, even sometimes software developers, about software support for risk-limiting audits, they assume the point is that RLAs involve these really abstruse statistical calculations, and so we need computers to do those really fast. And the underlying assumption often, and what I hear often, even sometimes from advocates, is that risk-limiting audits are a statistical method. So this is an idea that I absolutely want to kill dead. Can you help me can you help me destroy this idea? Look, we are in a building that is an engineering model. Okay, MIT, I assume very smart physical engineers and architects collaborated on designing this building, and then a whole lot of people got together and built it, and here we all are. I know nothing about engineering, and yet I probably could have helped to build this building if you gave me something simple to do. And actually, it took lots of different skills, not primarily the engineering skills, to build this building. And now we're all in the building, and we understand about the building whatever parts we feel we have to understand. Risk-limiting audits do involve math and getting the math right. Otherwise, the ceiling caves in, and we don't want that, especially while we're here. But fundamentally, risk-limiting audits are a kind of tabulation audit, which means that they involve human beings manually examining a sample of voted ballots, looking for evidence that the announced winners actually won and that the votes were counted correctly. That's what we're looking for, yeah? Thank you. It's always nice to have a cheerleader. So it's basically about how people manage paper. And the math, it's important, but it's not the main event. Okay, so I hope that resonates. And in this connection, Tammy Patrick very appropriately, I think, complained that sometimes advocates seem to be going out of our way to make RLAs sound easy. Now, I want to give you, as the person who did the software development for the Fairfax pilot, a little bit of a window into what someone like me might mean when we talk about, RLAs being easy. What we're really thinking about is the statistics, and I'll pop into that. But most of us are under no illusions that anything about elections is really all that simple. We're really not. Okay, and when you realize that every jurisdiction does like everything differently, and often jurisdictions have different goals for what exactly they want to get out of their audits, a lot of us are keeping busy trying to sort that all out, so it's fun. So the city of Fairfax, I always have to say, the city of Fairfax, Virginia, I'm not quite sure how it happened, somehow agreed to conduct a pilot risk limiting audit. And I think this possibility was first bruited somewhere in the middle of May. And we had an agreement maybe the last week of June. And the pilot was conducted about the first week of August. So what made this possible and, in my life, phenomenal is that Brenda Cabrera, the Director of Elections and General Registrar, and James Heo, I think he's officially the confidential policy assistant? Advisor, excuse me, I didn't mean to demote you, for the Virginia Department of Elections, and some other state and local officials, and on the other hand, myself and some other people from Verified Voting and maybe a few other places, collaborated very intensely on figuring out, what was going to happen, how it was going to happen, and I provided the software support. Now, in that I think actually Jennifer gave a really excellent rundown of some of the things that audit software has to do. In the case of this pilot, actually the first thing we had to do was retabulate the ballots, which, believe it or not, we did in batches of 25 because we had no way of imprinting them. And retabulating the ballots, obtaining a cast vote record for every one of those. So basically, I was looking around at at all the available tools and decided not to use any of them, wrote my own. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But possibly 2% of my time was spent dealing with the statistics. The rest of the time was, mostly listening to Brenda and James and others about the logistical requirements and trying to figure out how can software best support all the stuff that has to happen, including not only what they have to do, but how do we want it to look for people who come? What do we want them to be able to see? And if they ask for documentation, what do we want them to be able to walk out of the room with? That was 98% of my time. And man, it was a lot of fun. Okay. I wrote almost all this from scratch. I borrowed a sampling algorithm from Ron Rivest. Thank you, Ron. What else could I have done? Well, Philip Stark has 2 websites that actually can be used and have been used in actual elections to conduct entire election, post-election risk limiting audits, soup to nuts. That is possible. It's not impossible. Ron and collaborators have a growing number of similar tools that are hosted at MIT. There are open source R and Python libraries that provide lots of support for various implementations of election audits. As you've heard at this conference, Free and Fair produced the first version of the Colorado statewide risk limiting audit software. Democracy Works the second. Those are both open source projects. And both Free and Fair and Democracy Works remain active in the space. So there could be some sort of global clash for RLA software domination. I don't really know how that's going to go. In Rhode Island, or at least inspired by Rhode Island, there's a group of pro bono developers who are working on our own set of modules. I say our, but I'm not doing any of this coding at all. But they are working to provide software support for the Rhode Island pilot audit. Now, obviously, I couldn't draw on that for Fairfax. But you might wonder why I didn't use any of the others. But if you are a software developer, or if you've used other people's software in statistical analysis, you might sort of understand where I was coming from, because someone tells you, hey, look, this is cool, this is wonderful. There's so many open source libraries, everything you need, it's already coded. And you look at them, and a couple of those you can't even get to run on your laptop, and others, they seem to sort of work, but you can't quite figure out what they do or how you're going to make them do what you need them to do. And sooner or later, it's like, I'm going to do it myself. So that's, unfortunately, we are still at the point of a burgeoning of support and a burgeoning of insight, but we're just starting to get a handle on how to build modules that are write once, use often. Still working on that. And part of the problem behind that, or the circumstance behind that, is because of all the differences among jurisdictions that have been alluded to. As Jennifer said at dinner last night, we haven't totally nailed what the template is that everything has to implement. Yeah, we have the big bullet point items, but lots of the details. Okay, so all I want to say about this, the progress is happening. 10-year plan, yeah, and we're doing excellent work now, so I'm not too worried about it. Anyone who tells you that they have software support for risk limiting audit where you can, it's like ramen noodles, you can just add hot water and stir and you're there, kick them out of the room. Anyone who tells you, oh my God, don't go there, it's just too scary, kick them out of the room. Find people who will work with you and figure out problems and figure out solutions. And it's the software, election processes, it all has to work together. And we're finding in place after place, it can and it will. Thank you.
Okay. So, well, thank you, everyone. I'm Bob Giles. I have 8 minutes according to the clock, but so I think I could come pretty close. For those of you who have been to NASED meetings, we put a 10-minute time limit, and then I buzz you, and you're out. There may be some people in this room that have been buzzed by me, so feel free if I run over, Charles, you can return the favor. Yes. So I don't know if I'm the only one who finds it a bit humorous that I'm sitting, the guy from Jersey is sitting next to the guy from Verified Voting. So I don't know if Jennifer did that on purpose, and I hope somebody got a picture of this. But I know you've all been waiting, and the big reveal is how did New Jersey do risk limiting audits? Aren't they one of the 5 states that don't have a paper trail? So, so yes, we are. So I'm going to give a quick summary of kind of how we got there, and I'm going to give an overview from the kid looking on the outside, looking in. So basically, back in the spring, we got grant money, the new round of HABA money, the election security grant. New Jersey got about $10 million, and if you notice, I don't have a PowerPoint as the last guy of the day, so kudos to you guys for lasting this long, and no PowerPoint's your benefit. So we get this $10 million, and right away a lot of people want us to buy new voting equipment with it, and that's just not enough money. It's just the reality. So what the Secretary of State wanted to do is start heading in the direction of some type of paper ballot solution. So what we did, we took $2.5 million and we created a pilot program for jurisdictions to purchase voting systems with some type of paper trail. Could be a paper ballot system, could be a voter verified paper audit trail system, but we wanted them to start heading down this road. And by doing that, we actually have an auditing law on the books since roughly 2005 that we have not been able to implement because we haven't had paper trails. So we took another $250,000 and we put it into a category for pilot audits. So we could assist the counties in doing the audits and do some research. And so this past November, we had 3 counties decide to pilot some new systems. 2 of them used the ES&S Express Vote Excel, and 1 county used the Dominion ICX with a reel-to-reel paper trail. And then next week, December 11th, special school election, we have another county using the Dominion ICP with hand-marked paper ballots. So we'll now have 3 different solutions for the counties to look at, and that really was the goal, that counties go out and they look at different solutions, and then they start talking amongst themselves and decide what is best for their counties. So what we're finding out is that there are, now that we have to audit, each audit seems to be a little bit different. So we think New Jersey is poised in a very unique way and has a very unique opportunity to not only work with the academics, but also with the vendors. So the academics are writing papers on ways to audit, but the election officials have to figure out how to audit. And that's kind of where we're at. I'll be honest, I tried to read some of the papers. So there were absolute paragraphs that I just would go through because I'm not a statistician. And, well, thank you. So we're trying to develop these, and we're also working with the vendors, and there was a lot of discussion on, can systems audit or can they not audit? And what is the cost to develop equipment to audit? Well, again, New Jersey's in a very unique situation. This is why we want to work with the academics and work with everyone. The counties in New Jersey are about to purchase, over the next couple of years, a lot of equipment. There will be tens of millions of dollars spent on voting equipment in New Jersey. That will drive vendors to do basically what we want from an audit standpoint. And so, I have to say they've been really good about it, and I know they're getting there. But if they know one of our or multiple jurisdictions want to buy equipment in the next few months, they are going to ramp up their efforts to get systems that can do auditing the way we would like to have them done. Because by doing the pilots, counties were able to see whether it was going to be cumbersome or whether it was going to be easy, and that will absolutely factor into what they purchase moving forward. So some of the things we are doing with this opportunity that we have is, and it starts at the top with the Secretary of State, and Jay spoke about this. Our Secretary Way, is very supportive, and she wants to see us move in this direction, and she was actually at the audit and participated in the audit, so she wanted to be hands-on, so she understood it, which was fantastic. We knew we were going to need statisticians and auditors because we are not that. And they say timing is everything. Well, we lucked out because Jennifer is working on this project of hers. So I gave her a call and said, look, here's my state law. I don't know what it means. Can you read this and tell me what it means? So she did, and I think she passed it along to some of the people in this room. And then we started realizing, okay, let's kind of dissect this and figure out how we can start doing this audit. So we put together a loosely fit team. Jennifer was on it. Monica Childers was on it, and both of them brought the resources that they had with them. I reached out to our state comptroller's office, figuring they would have auditors that would help, and they were really excited, which excited me, that they got to do something different than their regular audits, and they've been reading about elections, so the timing, again, was perfect. So I got the deputy director of the audit division and 2 auditors to just jump on board, and they came to the audits. They had some really good questions. So again, making this sustainable, Jennifer's going to move on, and Monica's going to move on, but now I'm building a team that will help us do what we need to do. And we also included some county IT folks, and obviously we engaged our county election officials in those counties that had to do the pilots. And really, and Colorado talked about that, getting the locals to buy into the whole process and practicing. By doing these pilots, they were able, basically in a safe space, to ask the questions that they may not have asked in a more public forum, and make mistakes and make it clunky and cumbersome. And you know what? We did the the Express Vote XL 2 days in a row in 2 different counties. The first day what we learned was amazing how much better the second day was. And we were able to apply those to the second day. And again, because the counties were so into it, the person who was running it on the second day came to the first day because she wanted to know what was going to happen in her county the next day. So by engaging them early on and teaching them what the audits are all about, I think is really important. And if they understand it and they feel confident in their ability to run it, it will go a lot better. And that's really what we learned in a very short time. So like I said, we did 3 audits. We did 2 comparison audits on the Express Vote XL, and we did 1 polling audit on the Dominion ICX, the reel-to-reel. So the Express Vote currently does not print identifying numbers on the ballot to tie it back to the CVR. So we rescanned the ballots through the central count system to imprint the numbers, so we were able to do the comparison audit. We rolled the dice, and I have to say, when my son saw me leave the house with the dice, he asked if I was going to play Dungeons and Dragons at work. So for a brief moment, I was cool, until I told him, no, I'm doing auditing, and he's like, oh, well. So, you got to take the moments where they are. So we rolled the dice, and everybody becomes like a little kid. And even today you saw it. Everybody's making the Vegas jokes, and so everybody kind of got into that. And then we pulled the ballots, and then we entered them into the tool. And I want to thank Monica for the hours of time she put in to make the tool work. And I'll get into why we ran into some of those problems. But and then overall, the audits were successful. The results came back successful. So the 3 days, everybody felt really good. And it was a pretty impressive show that we were able to do all that in a short period of time. So some of the lessons we learned, the upfront prep is probably the most important thing. And again, because of what we learned on the first day, we were able to do a little better upfront prep on the second day, and that really made it helpful. And this was talked about during the course of today, but the terminology that's used has to get better and has to be unified, because we're talking about a cast vote record, and what you guys think of a cast vote record and what we think of a cast vote record and what the vendor thinks of a cast vote record are 3 different things. And we found that the ballot manifest was another thing. It drove Jennifer crazy, because I said, yeah, we have a ballot manifest. And she's like, how can you, as a vendor, have the ballot manifest that I'm talking about? So we kind of went back and forth on the terminology a lot. And then Jerome spoke about one export to identify all the necessary fields. That was a problem. We had multiple exports that we kind of got to everything, but we really need to sit down and put that into one export. Then we learned the naming conventions for the audit tool. We had so the batches were identified by the voting machines for the Express Vote XL, and the first county we did identify the voting machines A and B, but when you put A and B in the tool, it didn't like that. So it kind of scrambled the order of the ballot pulling because of that. So instead of just being able to pull one batch at a time, we were jumping back and forth because the A and B kind of messed up the tool a little bit, but that was a lesson learned. And again, that's where the practice comes in, that we were able to do better on the second day. And getting involved in the process, I think, really is, and I talked about a little bit earlier, that the counties, by them actually getting involved really made a difference. And it did for me too. Again, I just, trying to read the papers or listening to somebody give an overview of how risk limiting audits work, it just doesn't get you there until you're actually touching and doing it. And actually one of the vendors said, that the day was very tactile for him, and that's how he learned. He's like, you know what, I'm kind of touching and feeling this. I get it now, what you guys are talking about. So now they're able to go back and really develop the cast vote record and the manifest that we need to do to utilize the tools. So some of the challenges we ran into, how to perform a precinct level risk limiting audit, putting the numbers on the ballot to tie it back to the CVR. So we couldn't do that, so we ran it through the scanner to get there. what resources were available. Do the counties have the staff, the funding, and the equipment to conduct audits? We're definitely something we are looking at, and hopefully in working with the vendors, they will able to make that a much smoother process. And I think one of the bigger areas that we talked about that we're going to run into is the legal requirements and state laws. Do you audit before or after certification? And it was mentioned earlier that if you audit after certification, that's not really a risk limiting audit because you're doing it after you've certified the results. The problem we run into, and I know other states will have the same problem, is touching the ballots prior to any kind of recount or election challenge deadline. Where a race is close, and we talked about, and I heard today that the audits are good when the margins are further apart, but when you get closer to a recount. So I know in my state we would, if somebody lost by 1 or 2 votes and their district was pulled, I'm sure they would run in the court and say, you cannot, I do not want you opening that ballot box, because we have, and this is where sometimes the laws conflict. Our current law says that all the voting machine and related stuff are impounded for 17 days. So we have this impound law, and then we have a law that says do an audit before certification. So which one is going to weigh out is what we are going to have to look at and figure out. And it was talked about with Colorado where it really should be an administrative code or rule as opposed to the law, and that's something we're looking to do because it really needs to be flexible. And just hearing multiple folks speak today, there's different methods and there's different approaches, and I'm sure those are going to change. And if you lock something into law, good luck changing it in any kind of flexible and quick manner. So our next steps, and I think some of the next steps in general, what you guys did here today, I think was fantastic. And what Jennifer is working on, putting a paper together, and I think it's really important that that this be somehow whittled down to more layman's terms. When we were working on all the cybersecurity stuff that was going on, and it became, we were flooded with cybersecurity information, the 2 things we pushed to DHS and all those security folks was it has to be digestible and it has to be actionable. So if you guys are writing papers and pushing stuff to us, we need it to be digestible and we need it to be actionable. We need to be able to work with what you guys are coming up with. So, and the reality is there are many of you or some of you that may not like or agree with the voting systems that jurisdictions are going to purchase. So, and a lot of times that's out of most of our control. If the county is allowed to purchase the equipment they want, and that is what they feel they want to go with, and they're paying for it, that is a reality. So I guess my ask, and I will end on this, is in working with the academics, is finding a way to work through that and take your processes and work with our equipment. And I think that's, or really the other way around, taking our equipment and having you guys work your processes into our equipment. Because I think that's what happens. We look at this and you guys say, here's the best way to do it, and then we're left trying to figure out how that works with our equipment. So if we can flip that and say, here's our equipment, this is what we can do. And a perfect example is the precinct level audit. There's going to be the huge debate of, do you identify the ballot? Even if it's after it's left the voter's hand, if you're putting a mark on that ballot and that's tied back to the cast vote record and somebody can figure out the supposed random order of that cast vote record, and they can tie it back to a voter, because somebody can sit there and either count who voted on that machine, or like in our state, we have voting authority tickets that you sign, so we know the order of the voters just going into the machine. So that is something that I think a lot of jurisdictions are going to struggle with, because I really like having the imprint on there, and I like doing the comparison audit. I think it went really well, but it's how do we get there? Is doing the scanning after the fact going to be effective enough? Again, if we're going to do that, and advocates are going to come out and say that's a horrible thing and that's not the way you should do it, that doesn't help us. We've got to find that middle ground, because the equipment is the equipment, and you guys there's a lot of smart people out here that should be able to figure out how to audit the equipment that is purchased, as opposed to this is just the audit model that you need to follow. So I know I went over, but Thank you.
Should I tell him now that we had until 5:15? I really appreciate all of the panel members today and everybody that participated today. This has been such an awesome conference. I hope you all take a minute and just look around the room and recognize who's here and that the people are here after an election, right before Christmas, are here because they care about doing something to improve democracy and improve trust in our elections. So I think that's fantastic. We do have time for maybe one question for this panel. All right, Masterson.
It's quick and easy, I think. For Jay and Jerome and Mark about evaluation, and I won't even say certification, but approval of the software. What process does Indiana plan to use, if any, to evaluate? What process did you use in Colorado to assess the both applicability, usability, functionality, and integrity of the software that was used in the audit? And then how did you approach that in Virginia as well?
So in Colorado, it was with our time crunch in 2017. We were kind of in a bind time-wise to develop the software, and so I was testing the very first module the week I left, and so the guys Jesse and Danny got all the fun stuff in the following couple months, and so I was there on the front end of the development, but we had a lot of discussions with Free and Fair about what we wanted to see. Like we had a concept, and they just ran with it from there. So we kind of to get to that first step, we took a lot of lumps to say, okay, no, we need this input, we need this user interface, because we had two separate parts: the county-facing side and the state side, and so we had to get both sides functioning and talking to one another, and then it became what it is now. And so that was the pain we had to go through. But it was just, I think if we could all do it over again, we would give ourselves a lot more time to get to that point versus hey, we have 2 more months and then we have to actually make this thing go live.
And I think, let me just add, correct me if I'm wrong, that's all open source. So to Matt's question about who's verifying or looking for vulnerabilities, that's all been available for people to vet.
Yeah, and the state's, Secretary of State's IT department did a lot of that work. So we have, I say, I'll never be able to hide my Colorado bias. So if I say we, sometimes it's in reference to Colorado. But they have a great IT team and guys who really did a lot of heavy lifting on their end to vet it and do all of that back end work that they do. So they did an awesome job with that.
Were the counties involved in vetting it?
They were. I don't know to what extent, because like I said, I had the very first iteration, so Hillary Rudy would be able to speak more on what the rest of that looked like.
So in Indiana, of course, we have the luxury of time that they didn't have because we don't have that yet on our books with this pilot. But even at this early stage of the pilot, these questions have come up. What software will you use? How will you validate it? How will you test it, certify it? So I think this may go with now this critical mass of states that are starting to do this pilot RLAs, and some are actually required to do RLAs. Perhaps a group comes together to form some sort of standards for this, and that EAC could be part of that effort, one would think. Assistance is their middle name, as they say, right? So we are looking forward to being part of that kind of discussion.
Maybe this is a bit of an anticlimax. So we told you about, I told you about the development schedule. I don't know that that's agile programming. That's psychopathic programming, perhaps. But for what it's worth, I think the development philosophy was that the proof would be in the pudding. And what was super important was to produce artifacts that people could examine and compare to what they observed. Here's a set of cast vote records that the software produced. I didn't know if they would be, I really did not know how this audit was going to go. I'm happy to say the tabulation process worked pretty well. And here's the set of attested, audited ballots that anyone could compare by ballot ID and what they actually saw with their own eyes. And then, okay, we have 298 matches, we have 2 offsetting discrepancies. You can run that math any way you want and come up with basically the same answer the software did. So that's sort of an extension of the general idea of evidence-based elections. If you make the right kind of evidence available, that validates the system in use, as opposed to any a priori testing you could do. Doesn't mean, we need all kinds of software standards. I'm not opposed to any of that. But there is something very appealing about the proof being in the pudding.
Really short.
Follow up to Mark on that. Is your software generating pseudo-random numbers, and what's the evidence then that those are correctly generated?
The software we used in Fairfax uses Ron Rivest's sampler.py algorithm, and you can test that any way you want to, either with his code or with any other implementation of SHA-256 in counter mode.
You start with this.
Oh, yeah, well, right. There has to be a seed to the PRNG or it doesn't do anything. I'm sorry if I totally blew past the question.
But it's not a generated artifact the way those other things are listed.
It is. No, it is.
I'm sorry, what isn't?
The seed's recorded.
I think we're going to have to talk offline, but
Okay.
but the question was whether there's something in the output that someone can look at and say, yes, I can see for myself that's right. Is there something someone could look at and say, oh, yes, it generated random numbers correctly?
Yeah.
Other than the algorithm and the code, I get.
So the seed is recorded, the seed is observed, the seed is generated randomly by people rolling dice. All of that is observable.
And the sequence of pseudo-random numbers is there, so you could trace out that those do follow from that
That's right.
seed.
You could actually run
Thank
the
you.
sample yourself by hand if you were that sick. Yep.
Thank you. So we're going to turn the time over to Claire, I believe, to talk about the rest of the evening. But as soon as we leave here and go to our, what do we call it? Not reception, thank you. I was going to say snacks and drinks. I'm losing it. We want to keep these questions and this conversation going.